Thanks so much, Ben.
Thank you. Thank you for the warm introduction, Kodo. And just so grateful to be here. You know, I have had such an appreciation for the practice at Upaya for so long, for the work of your founder, eminent teacher, Joan Halifax. And I've had so many people I've met who've practiced and trained and been part of the Upaya community and just been doing beautiful work in the world. So it's really, just a joy and an honor to be able to be here with you and share a talk. So thanks so much to all the people. It looks so easy. I'm just here right now talking, but I know it takes a lot of people to make it possible so we can come together. So just a deep gratitude to all the people who are making this possible. So yeah, I'm going to talk about Vasubandhu's three natures, and I'm aware that that may be a set of words that have no meaning whatsoever for you, and that's okay. Hopefully, by the end, we'll have found some entrance points. And for those of you who've been studying this before, maybe I give you some new angles for how to look at the teachings. So I'm just going to kind of introduce the terms first and some kind of background, and then we'll get really into the pith of why these teachings are valuable for people who want to be free from suffering and help other people be free from suffering. So Vasubandhu was a Indian monk, probably in about the middle part of the first millennium, Common Era, so about 1,500 years ago. And Vasubandhu is an enormously influential figure. He produced a huge body of literature, which has been used and studied in many different Buddhist traditions. So Vasubandhu is a particularly important figure in all Zen lineages. Is considered one of the 6 ornaments of Tibetan Buddhism. So, we can all dream that we'll do something so beautiful that people realize we're an ornament. His texts, like the Abhidharmakosha, has been one of the most standard study texts in East Asian monastic settings for 1,500 years. So just a very influential person. And, his work tended to be focused. Well, he started off in a tradition that is kind of similar to what we now consider like Theravada Buddhism, not identical, but sort of some commonalities. And then he shifted over the course of his life and became really known as a Mahayana teacher. And this tendency of his to constantly be inquiring and transforming is really pervasive. So he wrote the Abhidharmakosha sort of early in his writing career. And this is like this massive compendium of Buddhist psychology. And at the time, people were just like, this is the most beautiful and perfect summation of early Buddhist psychology ever created. And people still use it for that reason. So I was like, wow, pretty cool. So then a few years later, he wrote something called the Abhidharmakosha Bhashya, which is a commentary on the Abhidharmakosha. So if you're still awake after all these words, he wrote a commentary on his own book. And the extraordinary thing about the commentary, it's all critique. So it's all pointing out things in his original work that everyone else was already saying, like, you really nailed it here, and saying, well, this doesn't quite make sense. This isn't the best way to look at this. This isn't really conducive to liberation. And we see this throughout his life, this sort of ongoing willingness to reinvestigate his own preconceptions and engage with the Dharma as a process and not a point of arrival. So later in life, Vasubandhu became associated with a Buddhist movement called Yogacara, which just means yoga practice. And in this case, yoga basically meaning a spiritual practice, you could say, or uniting the limited with the infinite. But anyway, Yogacara movement. And Yogacara is just a really influential set of Mahayana Buddhist teachings. And you may or may not have ever heard of Yogacara, but if you have practiced Buddhism for any length of time, you have absorbed Yogacara teachings because they've become a basic part of the fabric of Buddhist culture. So the basic impulse of Yogacara was to integrate early Buddhist psychology with the Mahayana Buddhist emphasis on collective and universal liberation. And the thing is, these are so commonly melded now, I think, in kind of our global multicultural context, because we just have a lot of dynamism culturally. But at the time, there was a lot of debate and argument, and people were like, no, the early Buddhist psychology is absolutely correct, or like, oh, those early Buddhist psychologists are just a bunch of fools and they're caught up in their system, and Mahayana liberation is way better. So there's a lot of polemic argumentation, which is, frankly, sometimes I get a little sad. I'm like, geez, you have to argue so much. But here I am arguing with them, so I guess I'm a part of the problem. So anyway, Yogacara was built, really emerges from this impulse to see how early Buddhist psychology and Mahayana collective liberation can be integrated effectively and can be more powerful when they are integrated than when they are one aspect is discarded. So where I encountered Yogacara and started to see this was through the teachings of Thich Nhat Hanh, who really bases his movement on Yogacara teachings. And, we can just see he really focuses on mindfulness, uses Abhidharma tools, which are from early Buddhist teachings, but then also has a big emphasis on engagement and collective liberation. And for a long time, I was like, I'd be talking about how Thich Nhat Hanh had based his movement on Yogacara, which, seemed like something I would do because I like Yogacara a lot. And then I started to think, well, did I just make that up, or is that true? But, I talked to people who are students of his, and a number of them had said, oh, I think that's accurate. And I had a really wonderful experience last year when I was teaching a course at Union Theological Seminary in New York. And I got there, and as I was getting ready for the class, it was just like a weekend course, like a visiting thing. Someone said, did you know that Thich Nhat Hanh came here and got a master's degree in 1963? And I was like, no. And he said, did you know that his master's thesis is on Yogacara and it's in the library? And I said, no. And I'm really a nerd, so I was pretty excited. And I do have that on PDF. I didn't have time to read it while I was there. Anyway, it's very beautiful. And so anyway, if you have been touched by the teachings of Thich Nhat Hanh, you have been touched by the Yogacara teachings, and you may hear a lot of reflections of them as I start to share about the three natures. And I would say, one of the main reasons that I focus on Yogacara teachings, or have quite a bit, is really to carry forth what I think is just such a beautiful vision that Thich Nhat Hanh, that really brought the fact that we can do the inner work of transformation, and we can do that in a way that's inseparable from the collective work. And, to some extent, I would say Mahayana teachings are just a whole body of things that are to enable us to engage in transforming really huge, harmful systems without getting burned out. And earliest Buddhist psychology really helps with that, because they give us tools to look inward and care for the emotional energies that are moving through our bodies. And because it can get kind of hard. For if anybody's done work around climate change, or unhoused populations, or addiction, or mental illness, or dismantling racism, or dismantling patriarchy, at some point you might just want to throw up your hands. You're just like, we've been working at this for so long, and it's still such a mess. And sometimes it feels like we're going backwards. And these teachings are really to provide a way to look at the world. So no matter what, we can say, what I do now matters. I can make an offering. And there is possibility for us all to be more free. So I'm going to move into talking specifically about the three natures. So the three natures is one of the main teachings of the Yogacara traditions. The two main teachings are generally considered what's called the 8 consciousnesses and the three natures. I'm not going to talk about the 8 consciousnesses, but if you've ever heard of the Alaya Vijnana, or the storehouse consciousness, that emerges from this aspect of Yogacara. But that's not what I'm talking about. Talking about the three natures. So the three natures is basically a set of teachings that gives us a way of looking at the world that is intended to help us move forward for collective liberation in a way that's joyful and free. And the three natures are, according to this teaching, inherent aspects of each thing. So each thing is of three natures, or you could say each thing has three natures. Sometimes you could say each thing have these three characteristics. So sometimes the term characteristic is used instead of nature in this case. So the three natures that everything has is that they are of imaginary nature, they're of dependent nature, and they are of complete realized nature. Imaginary, dependent, and complete realized nature. So the imaginary nature of things is what you think they are. The dependent nature of things is that they appear as they do, dependent on things other than themselves. And the complete realized nature is that they are not what you think they are. Pretty simple. Okay, maybe not. If you haven't picked up on it, this is an enormously challenging teaching. If you don't realize that, you basically haven't understood what I'm saying, or maybe you're just a realized being. I'm not sure. Maybe a little bit of both. The imaginary nature is what you think things are. The dependent is that they appear the way they do, dependent on other things. And the complete realized nature is that they are not what you think they are. The implications of this are, in particular, the implications of the imaginary nature are sometimes almost opposite of what you would think, because what we'll see is in Yogacara, we say things are imaginary because the fact that they're imaginary is why we have power, because we're contributing to the way the world is experienced, which is to say, imagined. But anyway, I'm going to read a little bit out of this book I wrote about the three natures, because I think this little passage will kind of, hopefully will illustrate the basic concepts of these three natures. So, every aspect of what we would conventionally call experience is of these three natures. All the sights, sounds, smells, tastes, physical sensations, thoughts, emotions, and our sense of being a self. For example, the cobalt blue car that I can see outside my window is of an imaginary nature. Whatever I am experiencing it to be right now, a memory, as I'm currently looking at letters on a screen, or now, as I turn my head to look at it again, whatever I think it to be is a construction of habits of consciousness and imagination. I suspect it will take some time for you to consider this a reasonable or useful claim. And so, dear reader, that's why I'm writing this book. That car is also of a dependent nature. Countless conditions that are not the car create the appearance of a car. Reflected sunlight, ocular nerves, supply chain software, oil refineries, the desire for wealth, and so on. This car is also of complete realized nature. It isn't what I think it is. Recognizing that things aren't what you think they are can radically disarm the patterns of your mind that cause you to suffer and cause suffering. For example, in order to see the car in my normal way, I am usually ignorant of or ignore a vast array of conditions on which the appearance of the car depends. Conditions that cause suffering in this time of climate crisis. These teachings are to help us move beyond this kind of ignorance. The so-called knowledge that white people are inherently superior to Black people, and the purported fact that race exists as a biological phenomenon were confirmed by 19th century scientific experiments, which have since been disproven. This caused and causes incalculable harm. This so-called knowledge is imaginary. It arises from conditions, and its complete realized nature is that it is not real. And yet millions of people thought and still think it is true. Although many of us do not, the impacts of this view are pervasive. It affects where people live, the jobs we have, the wealth we inherit, our access to education, and so much more. They are alive in how I experience the world. This teaching is here so we may continually grow in our capacity to end and transform harmful patterns of which we are often unaware. By learning to see the three natures of the ideas that maintain harmful systems, we open the way for liberation. The three natures can be misapplied and easily misunderstood. Understanding the imaginary nature invites humility, not grandiosity. It affirms agency. It does not deny experiences. Understanding the dependent nature affirms kinship with all things. It does not deny differences or boundaries. Understanding the complete realized nature brings faith, compassion, and joy. It does not deny suffering. The three natures provide medicine for our ongoing daily sufferings, no matter how small. So just to be explicit here, when we say things are imaginary, we're not saying they don't matter. In fact, so when I say the car is of imaginary nature, because the way I'm viewing it is very limited, the limitations of how I view it are what is creating suffering. And likewise with race, which is quite, the idea of race was invented fairly recently and has been disproven as a biological phenomenon. But clearly, the influence of the idea is very large. So imaginary phenomena are actually the grounds on which people suffer, and also the grounds on which they can enact things that are conducive to freedom from suffering. So I'm going to kind of move to talking about this imaginary nature. So, and you'll definitely hear some echoes of Thich Nhat Hanh here, I think. So the basic idea of the imaginary nature that we get in these Yogacara teachings is that our experience is created by a process of conditioning. And the standard metaphor for that conditioning is to say that each action plants a seed that creates a similar fruit. So action is just a translation of the term karma. So in this case, when I say each action, I mean each action of perception, cognition, so thinking, perceiving, feeling, or acting with the body. Sometimes we'll say body, speech, and mind, but I think for this case, it's a little bit more useful to say each act of perceiving, thinking, having an emotion, or doing something with your body plants a seed that will create a similar fruit in the future. So this is actually, I think, fairly intuitive. Like if you ever learned a musical instrument or heard someone try and learn a musical instrument, it goes something like this. All right. Da, 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 da. And then you try again. Da, 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 da. And you do that, you've planted seeds. You've planted seeds of the capacity to do what I just did. And if you do that thousands of times, pretty soon you can do re mi fa sol la ti do. No problem. So the capacity to develop abilities is really apparent. We know that, like language, like it's amazing. The fact that I can say these things and you can understand it, think of how many seeds of cognition had to be planted. It's not just in me and in you, but all the other people who had to participate in a collective process of planting seeds of cognition so that we could make sense of this. And it's integrated with perception, because the way we think about things has to do with how we see things, because we're naming things with our language. They have to do with how we feel. So like if I talk in this excited way, you might have some affective resonance, or you might be like, geez, I thought Zen teachers were chill. What's up with this guy? So anyway, the basic idea is that the experience that sentient beings have is constructed by our actions. And this is a pervasive way of looking at things in Buddhist thought. And it's for a very simple reason, because from the very beginning, the first teaching of the Buddha, the discourse on setting the wheel of Dharma in motion, the point is that you have liberative capacity. That teaching starts by saying there's a path that you can walk. Everybody everyone at any moment can do something that is beneficial. And kind of alarmingly, no matter what we do, we're planting seeds that create the kind of world we're going to live in, which, given a lot of things I've done, really gives me pause. So I'm glad we can acknowledge our karma during our rituals in the morning and go, all right, I'm ready to start again. So the imaginary nature ultimately is about reminding us that what we do always matters and that we can always do something that's beneficial. Also, just like to point out that by saying things are imaginary, there's like, on the one hand, it's often the case in Buddhist teachings that saying things are imaginary is a way of disarming their capacity to be afflictive. So if we say, as it says in the Diamond Sutra, that all phenomena are like a dream, like an illusion, like a bubble in a stream, that's so that when I get really wrapped up about something and start to freak out, I can be like, wait a minute. All this suffering comes from how I'm viewing the situation, and it's not absolutely real. And sometimes the whole pressure of the situation can come down multiple levels. So it's very powerful. That's a very common, the most common way to use the idea that things are imaginary in Buddhist teachings. But Yogacara very specifically makes the pivot to emphasize that because they're imaginary, we have power. So, moving on to the dependent nature of things. So this is another idea that pervades the Buddhist tradition, that things arise because of this, there's that. And there are actually many different ways to think about dependency in Buddhist teachings. It's not cut and dried, but it's a big point of emphasis in the Yogacara. And we start to see, I will just say, a shift towards a more positive view of the dependent nature of things in the Yogacara. And, is there anything Thich Nhat Hanh emphasizes more than that things depend on other things? It's just so powerful I've read a bunch of his books a long time ago, and I just go to the store and pick up a piece of broccoli and think about all that had to happen for that broccoli to be there. That someone had to plant those seeds, that someone had to drive a truck, that the sun had to shine, that worms had to crawl around, that rivers and rain had to flow. I mean, amazing. This little moment that's just like, oh, I got my broccoli, I have to go eat mine. And instead, I'm in this position of amazing gratitude and wonder. So acknowledging the dependent nature of things can be really, it's a very broad range of impacts. And it's quite common that it feels really good. So one of the most common ways people get a sense of the dependent nature is just by coming and practicing Zazen. Because when we practice Zazen, the aspect of our mind that's designed to define and divide and figure out gets to have a little break. And so instead, what we have is a little sense of awareness that is not dividing, that's only relational. And so it's like a felt sense of your relationship to what is going on. And this is quite common. You may think, I've never felt anything like that, but it's pretty common. People will come to our Zen center. They're pretty new. They come and sit Zazen in the morning and, come back a few days later and they'll say, oh, I came to Zazen, and then we have a lake right out in front of our place. And they'll say, I walked out afterwards and just walked along the lake. And it's like I'd never seen it before. I just felt so much more close to the environment, and I could just hear the sounds and the animals. And I felt like we were just like living together in this space. Yeah, it's just a natural dissolving of alienation. That is one of the most basic and more beautiful benefits of Zazen and similar practices. So it can feel really good when we realize the dependent nature. Alienation is painful and it's pervasive. The sense of being separate, cut off, alone. But on the other hand, realizing the dependent nature can also be pretty painful. Because one of the implications of the dependent nature here, if everything is dependent on everything else, everything is inseparable. You can't be separate from anything. And so that means that you can't, in the ultimate sense, you can't be separate from any of the suffering that happens anywhere. And facing this can be pretty hard. It can be hard. Ultimately, it can be very liberating, but in the moment, sometimes it's really difficult. So seeing the dependent nature of things, like if you have a very fraught relationship and you actually are willing to go to that person and be with them right within the friction of that and be willing to connect when it's hard. It's like, you're actually moving closer to recognizing your dependency, but there may be pain involved. Or when we look, it's like a while ago, I was on a, how will I put this? Like I was on a board type of thing. And there's a lot of people on the board. And then some of the women on the board said, the men on this board are manifesting a bunch of harmful patriarchal tendencies. And it's really impeding our work, and it's really painful for us as people. And we want you to do something about it. And that wasn't fun to hear. It's like, oh, that hurts. And of course, then I want to be like, oh, maybe I could blame it on someone else. Right. See how I want to get out of recognizing my actual dependency. I'm part of a patriarchal system that harms people. I can't not be a part of it. That's what we live in that. So then it's like, when I can open up and be like, all right, that's just true. Then I can touch the affliction first and move through the affliction and just be like, now I'm moving into a more authentic relationship because we can really talk about what's going on with this group of people. And, I can convene a meeting with the men in the group and be like, let's talk about how to stop doing that. I don't know. I hope it was helpful. Anyway, this is just an example. Same thing, people, if you look at the work of Joanna Macy, calling people to actually do the grief work around climate change. What she's talking about is facing dependency and dealing with the anguish that comes up. I need to gesture more effectively. And then being able to move on. And here I'll say, this is why I don't have time to spend on this here, but the Buddhist psychology gives us really nice tools for dealing with those afflictions that come up and caring for them as they arise in our consciousness. So we face the dependency and acknowledge whatever feelings come up as we realize how much we are a part of this harmful system that's, killing entire species and, denuding the planet and robbing the future of our children. It's painful, right? So we can pretend it's not true, or we can move towards dependency. The first noble truth is to recognize suffering, and embedded throughout the Four Noble Truths is the idea of dependency. So we can see this ties right back to the earliest teachings. Same thing with, when people let's talk about racism in our communities or in our culture, and people get really reactive. It's so painful. They're like, I can't even talk about it. Yeah, this is really hard to face dependency sometimes, but this has been my experience. Facing the truth is more freeing, more joyful, more intimate, and creates more possibility than any kind of pretending. Now, having said that, I know we all have our limitations, and sometimes I just have to be like, I'm turning off the news. I'm not going to any of those meetings that have me so wound up, and I just need to sit here and breathe and look at some trees and go for a walk. Take care of this little frame. Can't do everything. So, imaginary nature, dependent nature. I was going to read you a passage about dependent nature, and I got all excited about talking. I want to read this little section here. Sorry. Right. We don't passively receive the reality of the world through our senses and then respond to it. The world we experience is created. It is, as Vasubandhu says in the text, the active cognition of seer and seen. Our life is created by our karma, and we create karma in every moment. We have the power to plant seeds that will create a better world. This body of teachings emphasizes the impact of each moment of intentionality. Our power lies in the quality of heart and mind we offer to the moment. Why do I think this worldview is more effective than materialism for healing our suffering and freeing us from collective modes of violence, oppression, and destruction? I will answer with some lines from a Chinese Chan nun named Baoqi, who wrote, "The vastness of karmic consciousness is hard to prove. But when Mr. Zhang drinks, then Mr. Li gets drunk. Sometimes I get a call or I see an obituary telling me that another friend of mine has died from addiction. I've lost a dozen friends so far, and I can never know what part my enabling of their intoxication played. I'm a recovering addict. I can never know what part my enabling of their intoxication played, or the impact their deaths and addictions will have on future generations of their families. The web is too complex to map with materialist tools. I can never know the impact of the thousands of hours I've spent working with addicts in recovery either. I have witnessed the awakening of so much freedom." One of Baoqi's inspirations, the great Chan nun Miaozong, wrote, "When outside the diamond door he glowered, inside the stable, the wooden horse's face turned red." In the verse above, there is no physical connection between the man's glower and the wooden horse's face, and yet there is reaction and connection. We cannot ultimately know when or where the results of any karmic seed will manifest, but manifest they will. Miaozong wrote her lines in a Chan compilation she created in the 12th century. But could she have known that in the 17th century, Baoqi and her Dharma sister Zukui, looking to revive the rarely recorded teachings of a female master of Chan, would pull them from obscurity and write their own commentaries? Or that Beata Grant in the 21st century would again revive them in English? I believe that buying a chunk of an animal killed thousands of miles away, or offering a caring smile for a person on the street, as well as each tiny moment of anxiety, desire, or compassion you cultivate, has an impact on every living being. I cannot measure it. Miaozong says the wooden horse's face turns red. A wooden horse is a classic Buddhist metaphor for something that has no reality or causal agency, like the horns of a rabbit, a wooden man, or a stone woman. Miaozong invites us into a worldview of mystery, where we don't know or see what is ultimately real, but where an angry glare causes suffering we can't calculate, where a smile has radiance beyond the limits of our knowing, where our actions really matter. All of this isn't real, but it's as real as it gets. So here's some good news. Everything is of complete realized nature. So imaginary nature, it's of dependent nature, and it's of complete realized nature. So the complete realized nature is called that because it's what Buddhas see. So Buddhas see that things are not what we think they are. That's already true, though. So we're already seeing what Buddhas see. We just don't know, usually, that they're not what we think they are. So, if you've heard this, samsara and nirvana are inseparably, you are Buddha. It's rooted in the same basic body of thought. But here we have a very specific, logical way of explaining why you're already Buddha. Because everything you think is a thing isn't. And what makes a Buddha is that the things they think are things are not things. Okay, well, you may have to read the book, but amazing. What we're talking about when we say that things are of complete realized nature is that the afflictions we experience come from trying to grasp things that aren't really graspable, to manipulate things that you can't manipulate, to view a world of objects where there are no objects. So the shift with the complete realized nature is to realize there are no objects, but what I do still matters. So we're free to act, we're free to contribute to liberation, but we're free from the exhaustion of trying to control outcomes in a world where there is so much suffering. So then we're free to just keep going, So the idea that things are already of complete realized nature is oftentimes in Buddhist literature, they'll talk about the complete realized nature of your environment and of your body. So at the end of Vasubandhu's 30 verses on consciousness only, he says, This is the inconceivable, wholesome, unstained, constant realm, the blissful body of liberation, the dharma body of the great sage. So this place, inconceivable realm, this is the Buddhist body. So I'm pointing outward and inward here, but you could do the pointing. And in fact, the point of that text is for you to chant it and for you to be saying, this is the inconceivable, wholesome, unstained, constant realm, the blissful body of liberation, the dharma body of the great sage. Hakuin Zenji says this a lot more simply when he paraphrases it at the end of the Song of Zazen. The last two lines are, this very place is the lotus land, this very body, the Buddha. When Dogen Zenji writes his universal recommendation for Zazen and explains why we should practice Zazen, he starts with the same teaching. The way is originally perfect and all-pervading. How could it be dependent on practice and realization? It is never apart from this very place. What is the use of traveling around to practice? This very body is free from dust. Who could believe in a means to brush it clean? Why do we practice Zazen? Because everything is already of complete realized nature, so we can just act like it. So, I'm going to read you two short passages from the book to wrap up this talk. One is about the complete realized nature of this little me, or maybe this little you, or maybe you're very big, I don't know, whatever. And the other will be about the complete realized nature of our environment. This is from a chapter called Already Buddha. When I came to Buddhist practice, I was seeking something else. I sought an escape from the anguish I experienced. My therapist told me it was the anguish of trauma from the past reproducing itself. My psychiatrist told me my brain didn't process serotonin properly. My addiction recovery friends called it defects of character, self-will run riot. My Buddhist studies called it afflictive karma. All these ways of looking at it have their utility, and I am deeply grateful for all who have supported me in finding the wondrous, joyful existence of today. When we suffer, when we see the suffering of others, it is right to seek wellness, to seek something else. However, it is also true that there is not something else, that you and I are not and cannot be broken. For if there is brokenness, there must be a wholeness that is elsewhere. This is a duality, and duality is just a habit of mind. And this idea that all dualities are not ultimately true is one of the central themes of Vasubandhu's treatise on three natures. So here is a little reading, a short reading about the complete realized nature of where we are. Recently, I heard a talk by a Dakota elder named Bob Clanderud. He spoke of the total kinship of all life. He told us that the confluence of the Mississippi and Minnesota rivers near my home on US-occupied Dakota land is called Bedote. For the Dakota, Bedote is the origin of the universe, the land of Genesis. In his words, it is Eden. He asked us, now that you know you live in Eden, how will you choose to live? So it's been really wonderful to have this time with you. Really appreciate your attention. And I know you have so much practice and wisdom wherever you are. So thank you all so very much. Take care.
Thanks so much, Ben. That was got to be one of the most entertaining discussions of Buddhist philosophy I've ever heard. And you have a way of really bringing it to life. And I'm really excited to say that we'll be studying Yogacara and Vasubandhu in this coming spring practice period. That'll be April 3rd to the 28th. And I hope you'll be a part of that and be in our seminars. We're out of time almost, but I have 2 minutes. I really wanted to ask this question, which often comes up about the imaginary nature and basically the relative view that, something like the way your car runs, that blue car, science, has a kind of truth to it, and it may be imaginary nature, but that's different from delusive imaginary nature. You could call it like racism or something like that's just not true on that sense. Could you say something about the different levels of truthiness of imaginary nature?
Truthiness. Yeah. Well, there's a sort of practical truth, which is, when the Buddha says speak the truth, it's as a basic principle of right speech. It doesn't mean you always have to like speak the absolute truth, but you should say what is conducive to well-being. So the principal thing here is that Buddhist philosophy does not concern itself with objective truth. It concerns itself with liberation from suffering. And so it does provide a different angle. And it's you kind of arrive at a complicated question I probably can't answer in 1 minute beyond saying you really need to shift that when we're talking about truth in Buddhist thought, the point is that truth is what leads to non-suffering. And so the thing is, yeah, we know how to eat food instead of throw it on the wall. We know how to drive a car instead of not drive it or whatever. But so those are relative truths, but we're trying to keep coming back to how does what we do impact the well-being of sentient beings? Because right now, the focus on objective truth we have that gets us cars, gets us climate change. So we're trying to shift how we think about truth with this teaching.
Beautiful answer. Thank you so much, Ben. And Roshi's on and watching from Tokyo, or anyway, Japan. And she blurbed your book, I think, and I hope everyone gets the book. If the link isn't in the chat, somebody said they didn't see it. I put it in earlier. I'll go ahead and send it again. But yes, thank you so much. That was very edifying, and I can't wait to dive into that study, hopefully with you and with Sensei Monshin and Kathy Fisher and Sensei Shinzan and Sensei Kozan in the spring.
Love to be
Just
involved.
yes, a couple things about upcoming programs. We have a program with Frank Ostaseski and Sharon Salzberg this weekend on Sunday, Being Awake online. So please join. We'll put that link in. And then our fall practice period is coming up. But before it, we have a Zazenkai with Sensei Kozan on September 30th, just a day long of meditation. So please check out our website and join for that. If you're local, or you can come the day before and join us for Zazen from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. and go deep into that experience. So I just love what you said, Ben, about it's just the natural arising of Zazen is that you're kind of putting down the mind of conceptualization and dividing up, and you're just letting that awareness that's natural to us experience the world. And that for this is why we're talking about beginner's mind, right? Is like for just even beginners who just have a taste of that, it's like, oh my God, I lived my life in a way I haven't seen before, and it was just so touching. Yeah, let's do that. So Zazenkai, September 30th, let's do it. Practice period, we have 2 Zazenkais and a sesshin there, so please join for that. And if anyone out there would like to live a life conducive to practicing like that, please check out our resident program. Thank you so much to all our residents who are here in Zoom, and we'll be dancing tomorrow morning. Fingers crossed, if everybody's doesn't have COVID, we will have Gate of Sweet Nectar liturgy tomorrow morning for the new moon, with Sensei Monshin being the doshi, the officiant. So we'll see you all there, and we'll end with the 4 great Bodhisattva vows.